And welcome everybody to another conversation in the most important conversations. I'm Chad Lefevre and I have September Dohrmann with me as usual. September, how are you today?
Doing fantastic. Enjoying the weather here in Florida. Starting to cool down for us. So I'm very much enjoying the porch swing.
Yeah, that's always the best time. I remember when I used to live in Las Vegas, it was around this time. October was when patio season was, which was quite like the opposite of what you'd think, right? Like if you're in any of the northern states or northern countries, that's not patio season, but we were really looking forward to it. So I get that.
Yeah.
You've got something special on your mind today to share with us a little bit about what you've been thinking about and what you've been reading.
Yeah, so I'm subscribed to the Harvard Business Review. They got some really awesome articles that's on there, and I came across one, and I really love reading about leadership. And one that I read last week was what it means to be a moral leader. And I just want to read a little excerpt from that article that I was reading here. He says what's interesting about AI is that it challenges our monopoly on intelligence. We're no longer the smartest. What's the one thing a machine will never have, which is a heart. I actually think that the technology revolution is putting into stark relief and focus the imperative to scale that which comes from the heart. There's an adage of moral leadership that only that which comes from the heart enters the heart. From an economic standpoint, in the industrial age, we hired hands and we hired strong hands. Then we went into the knowledge or information economy and we hired heads and we favored knowledge and expertise and specialization. I think that we're going into a more human age where the qualities that emanate from the heart, like the ones that were mentioned in the article before, empathy, compassion, the ability to do the right thing, and our capacity for ethics and morality and consciousness is something that we will have to now scale. I get chills just reading it again. I'm so grateful that we're moving into this more humanistic era. You can look back over the different times of when our parents grew up in business or our grandparents grew up in business. It's so vastly different. And I love that we're focusing on what Steve Jobs said. It's the matters of the heart.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's a big thing that is at the center of everything that we do at the Most Important Conversations, or TMIC, with the whole life architecture work, is emotional sobriety. And I've said so many times that I believe that emotional sobriety, you could call it emotional intelligence, but emotional sobriety includes emotional intelligence and then some. So, but anyway, the moral side, the emotional side, the who we are as human beings side of the equation, which has been largely ignored for at least the better part of the last century, with little pockets here and there that are obviously always talking about it. But generally, as the thrust of our focus as a society, as an economy, has not really paid that much attention to the human being side of things. And I've said for a long time inside of our TMIC whole life architecture workshops that emotional sobriety is the superpower of the next 100 years. And that the reason it has to be the superpower, and you brought up AI, so we can talk about that in a second. But even aside from AI, even before AI was a thing that we were all chattering about, which incidentally, it's not that new. It's been around, for at least 20 years. And even in an intelligent form of it, it's been around for about 10 years, but it's, started to leap in terms of its ability. So that's why we're all paying attention. But even before that happened, the whole AI conversation, you just have to look around at the world and see that the world is largely by men. But that's not inherently the issue. What is the issue is whether it's men or women, the world is largely run by emotional teenagers at best. At best, we have people with their fingers on the nuclear codes who are about as emotionally intelligent and emotionally sober as a teenager may be, right? I always think of like wars as two children throwing sand at each other in a sandbox. The unfortunate thing is they're using deadly lethal weapons and not sand, but it's the same it comes from the same place. The inability for the leaders on either side of the war to be emotionally sober, to handle themselves in a way where they're not a walking reaction and an ego to not getting their way. And that ties into something I won't get into immediately unless we want to go there. The idea that all of reality for human beings is seen through a perception. And so it's an argument of perceptions. And when we don't get our own way, well, when children don't get their own way, what do? They stomp their feet, they throw things, they yell, they scream, and it's no different with, the majority of people so-called ruling the world. They're hardly ruling it. They've manipulated it to the point where they are in power, but they are still stuck at age 11, 13, 7, whatever.
And I think this is, to me, where the business owners come into play, because I'm seeing that more and more leaders are focused on their own emotional intelligence.
Mm.
And as you know, everything starts at the top, at the very top. And when I think about these political leaders carrying on like they do, it's such a bad example for those that don't know any better, or don't have the support system or the means to know that there's a better way of doing it. And that article referenced that there was this command and control type of leadership in the past, which we can see in our political systems. And I think more and more people are stepping into this heart space that we want to empower people. I don't want to control people. That's exhausting.
Yeah.
I'm, working to control myself, but working on my own emotional intelligence is far easier as a leader, to lean into those skill sets, to have compassion and understanding and empathy for what your teammate or somebody, your peer, is going through, and showing up that way, and the results that come from that is just, it's got that something to it that you can't get with command and control.
Yeah. Well, think about it. First of all, you talk about compassion, and I want to highlight something, that until someone realizes that their experience of reality is not objective in the sense that they're experiencing reality as it is, but rather they're only experiencing reality as they perceive it, until someone really gets that and really delves into all that means, compassion will be very difficult for someone to experience and have, because compassion requires the awareness and the understanding that the awareness and the understanding that my view of what's going on, my view of the world, my view of this situation or this experience is just my subjective perceptual view. Therefore, what the other person is experiencing, that's their view. And once I get that, I can actually have compassion, because I'm no longer coming from the place where I'm trapped in what I'm right about. And I'm trying to use command and control, if you think about what that is, which is just an assertion of my will. It's a do as I say, not as I do. And so it's an assertion of the will that, hey, I see reality as it is. Whether you do or you don't doesn't even matter to me. Do as I say. And so there's no way to have compassion there, because your viewpoint is, I see the world the way that it is, or I see what needs to be done, they don't. And it's coming from this, I see reality from a total objective place, they don't, and I don't have time to teach them, so just do as I say and not as I do, right? And so, but as soon as someone gets that what you're experiencing as reality is just your subjective perceptual experience, and no one else is sharing that experience with you, you're actually trapped in a little perceptual bubble. As soon as someone gets that, suddenly compassion is a possibility. But it is not a possibility when someone thinks that they absolutely know what's going on and everyone else is wrong, and I need to show them and they need to just follow and do what I say. And that's the old model, like you said. And now, as soon as someone gets that they're in their own perceptual bubble, that's where emotional sobriety has to come in, because now I'm 100% responsible for my experience, my emotional experience in life. how I show up and all the inner chatter in my mind, the judgment, the self-loathing, the loathing of other people, all the things that go on. And so now there's work to be done inside, right?
Yeah, very much so. And I think another really important layer to all of that is the self-awareness.
Yeah.
I don't think it's enough to just know that we're all having our own unique experience and having understanding with that, but being self-aware of your own experience, self-aware of how you feel, self-aware of how you interpret what's happening to you. A perfect situation is I have a friend who's buying a business from a couple, and there has to be a partnership for 3 years, and I'm always talking to him about, you need to understand where they're coming from, their
Right.
world, the fears that they have. And those fears, in a meeting that I had with them, those fears causes you to focus on the wrong thing.
Mm-hmm.
You're not
Mm-hmm.
focusing on the opportunity that's around you when you're so consumed with all these fears. So having the self-awareness of, oh, I'm feeling fearful today. What is that about? And begin
Right.
to understand all of those pieces. And I think it's easier to step into the emotional sobriety element when we can have that self-awareness, because you have to pause with emotional sobriety. There's a
Mm-hmm.
pause is very powerful. A lot can happen in the pause. And having that moment to just stop and notice what you're feeling and question those feelings. It's kind of like, if you're feeling afraid, you've given me this advice before in the past. If you're feeling fearful about something, set with the feeling and just set with the feeling. Notice it. Don't try to avoid it. Notice the feeling, notice the feeling. And what happens is it eventually kind of melts away
Mm-hmm.
the more you start to sit with that. And it's an interesting experience to have there. Like, oh, I'm not really feeling fearful. It's just old programming popping in,
Right.
that old
Right.
synapse wanting to fire to say, oh, this situation looks familiar to this, therefore I should be afraid. But I think having that self-awareness is critical. And so what do you think in terms of how can somebody be more self-aware if that's not a skill set that they possess at the time?
How can someone be more self-aware if it's not a skill set? Well, I guess the first thing that they can do, and this is sort of, you kind of just alluded to it, and it's part of the emotional sobriety, and I think I should define that briefly. What is emotional sobriety? It's the ability to feel your emotions completely and entirely and totally, and not be suppressing and running from them. Number one, it's the ability to no longer be a walking reaction to everything that happens in your life. Whether it's people or circumstances, you're not in reaction, which relies on our unconscious habituated conditioning, and it happens to us within 1.7 to 2.2 seconds. There's been an emotion, a reaction, and then we tell ourselves a logical story. We rationalize how we've reacted, right? Whatever that reaction is. I say that we tell ourselves rational lies about, because we don't want to think that we're out of control. So it's the ability to, emotional sobriety is the ability to not be a walking reaction, but rather to be a response, to be able to respond to life, right? Emotional sobriety is the ability to learn from our emotions, to understand the wisdom that are actually under the emotions. Oftentimes the emotions that we call quote unquote negative, there's no such thing as a negative or a positive emotion. We've labeled them as such. But what feels negative to us is a sign that something in our life, whether it's the circumstance right in front of us, or it's circumstances that are compounding in all of our life, but there are things in our life that are out of alignment with who we really are. And so to be emotionally sober is to be able to observe, be with those so-called negative emotions, like you were just saying, sit with them and get curious about what's under that. Why am I feeling fearful? Why am I feeling angry? Why am I feeling depressed? Or whatever the feeling might be. And to get curious, because it has nothing to do with what's going on out there. You hear people oftentimes say, well, you made me feel blah, 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 right? No one makes you feel anything. People do what they do. You feel what you feel. And most people are just in a reaction to that versus getting curious. Well, why am I feeling this way? Right. So I think, to answer your question, if people don't have the self-awareness, and they haven't practiced and studied and done the work with us around emotional sobriety, what's one thing that they can do to begin to develop that self-awareness? And I think one of the most powerful things that people can do is just what you said a few minutes ago, which is to start to get into the practice of pausing when you feel an emotion creep up. Try to, it's difficult at first, but people can get good at it. Try to insert a space of not reacting, of nothing between the feeling and whatever you would normally do. And then that will start to develop an awareness, because you're going to start to be able to feel the emotion creeping up, and you'll have awareness of it, and you'll be able to intercept the reactive part. And as soon as you can do that, then you can start to get curious about what's at the source of that emotion. Why is it coming up? You know, our emotions are really wise. They're trying to teach us things. They're trying to help. They're a navigation system. If you're living a life where you're feeling upset, angered, frustrated, fearful, any of these so-called negative emotions, there are things in your life that are out of alignment with who you really are. And most people just tolerate it, repress it, or react to it. And if you want to live a life of power and peace, you've got to develop that awareness, develop emotional sobriety, which takes a lot more work than people think. I mean, it's years of work to develop it. But the more you do it, the more powerful you feel, the more, because you're no longer a victim. I guess another way of putting it is developing emotional sobriety flips people from being a victim into a place of total freedom and power.
Which is at the heart of a good moral leader, tying back into the article that I was reading there. You had mentioned that, people can't make us feel any type of way. And I think that's a very fine line, that when you're in the middle of it, you're like, what are you talking about? This guy just said that my baby's ugly.
Yeah.
Of course that's going to trigger me. And that's the key word there, trigger.
Yeah.
And I feel like the word trigger is being overused, but I don't really have a better word for that. And it's this whole like slow down to speed up. I've heard that over the years, and I've really begun to understand that. And I think it can be applied. Well, I know it can be applied to the emotional aspect as well, that when somebody says or does something, they're in their own world, whether they're being malicious or not, or unintentionally trying to hurt your feelings, maybe, but that's really not any of your business. What is your business is how you or how I respond or react to that. And there's a lot of different scenarios where we have these examples of where we can pause. When somebody's in front of you and says something or does something that pushes a button or hurts touches a wound perhaps that you have, it's very difficult in the beginning to pause in that moment, because we want to defend, we want to protect ourselves. That part of us that has been developed inside of us to protect ourselves, to protect our heart, to protect our intention, to protect our integrity, whatever it may be, that piece is immediately going to pop up. So there's that scenario. Then you have another scenario where, maybe you're working on something and you're getting super frustrated. Nobody's creating that for you. You're creating that feeling within yourself, that self-awareness. Oh, I'm creating this frustration. It reminds me of my boyfriend has a 7-year-old, and she was a micro preemie. So for the first 2 years of her life, she was on a trach and didn't learn how to walk and feed herself until she was after 2. So she's developmentally just a little delayed. She'll catch up. So I had her learning how to stick a piece of tape on paper to stick it against the wall, getting some of that eye-hand coordination going on. And she was so frustrated with getting this tape and it paper falling, and she was so frustrated. And even at 7, she has learned to just literally step back, take a deep breath, or just walk away for a moment. And that's another way of just simply pausing, but you have to have that self-awareness of, what am I feeling in this moment? What am I feeling in the moment? And if it doesn't feel good to you, pause, just stop, take a breath for a moment. Now, you've also mentioned before in the past that emotional sobriety isn't just about negative emotions. It's also some of the positive emotions that we experience as well too. Say a little bit more about that one, because I'm still learning that piece. Like, but I want to feel good. I want to embrace it. I want to, not overreact, but
Yeah.
really engage in that feeling of good, pleasure.
Yeah. So one of the last pieces of emotional sobriety that we deal with when people are going through the whole life architecture is not chasing an emotional state,
Mm.
right? So oftentimes what we will experience is what we call positive emotions, right? Happiness or things like that. And we want that to last forever. We don't want it to go away. We desperately try to recreate it. Once it's passed, we try to recreate it. How many of people have been on holidays or had a great experience out with friends and let's do this again? And it's like we try to recreate it, but you can't recreate that, right? But besides the fact, you're now attached to an emotional state. And think about what the attachment to an emotional state does. Now you're trying to recreate happiness. And so you've got these high expectations of what that's needs to feel like, look like, how you're going to do it, because this is how it worked last time. So let's just try to replicate this. And you're attached to that. And what you've done in that moment is in terms of chasing an emotional state that is positive, is you've created in that moment the opportunity for a negative emotional state to triumph, because in your attachment to the positive and trying with all your might to recreate that positive emotional state, you're bound to be disappointed by it. And then you're going to have these negative emotions come up, because the reality is um, our emotions are not, for better or for worse, for good or bad emotions or whatever, are not places we're supposed to hang out. Think of an emotion as a compass. It's telling you that you're on your path and you're headed in the right direction, or you're not on your path and you're headed in the wrong direction for you, right? Not for anyone else, but for you. So when you feel a positive emotional state, that's just a sign you're headed in the right direction. Just keep walking that direction, but don't get attached to that experience and that moment where that positive emotional state popped up, because that's just a moment on the journey. And if you get attached to it, you've now created the conditions to be at a loss of power, because now you're going to try and recreate that moment. And it wasn't you who created that moment anyway. The moment was just a moment where everything in your life was aligned, and you be in that moment, you appreciate it. By the way, isn't it interesting that we're always trying to recreate moments that we were happy and joyful in? The flip of that is, what does that say about your life? If you're so attached to that moment, does it mean the rest of your life is so unhappy and unjoyful? And are you such at a loss of power, and are you such a victim that that's why you have this attachment to that one time? Remember that time? Oh, it was so good. Why isn't all of life that way? In a similar way, I've said over the years, like Valentine's Day, right? I'm like, I don't understand why we create days in the year. Like, think about the expectation. The flowers go up 2-3 times in price, chocolates, expectation, right? It's this expectation. It's kind of like what I'm just saying. We're trying to create this moment. So Valentine's Day, it's official, February 14th. You have to create the moment. And I'm sitting here thinking, so it's just one day a year that your relationship is supposed to be amazing, and we all hyper focus on that like a bullseye. I mean, why not? I actually reject Valentine's Day. It's the one day that I'm going to relax and just feed myself. The rest of the year, I should be feeding my relationship. Forget Valentine's Day, right? But we, as human beings, we do this. We get so trapped in our mind around trying to create situations. What we should be focusing on is creating ourselves, who we're being.
Mm.
And then the situations are irrelevant, because wherever we go, as the saying goes, wherever you go, there you are. And so if you're emotionally sober, you're paying attention to the navigation system that your emotions are creating for you. You're making sure that you're heading in the right direction, in the sense of your emotions, when you experience so-called happy emotions or positive emotions or joyful or peaceful or content or any of these things, that means you're aligned and you're headed in the right direction. And when you're not experiencing them, There's something to look at. There's not something to react to. I think the Harvard Business Review article was a good one, because it's kind of shining a light on the fact that, and it's funny, I was just talking to someone this morning about this. A lot of business leaders who have employees in their company are noticing that their employees are just a little off right now, like at best, depressed, low energy, not very motivated, worried. There's a lot of worry about the future. And it's affecting morale in the company. It's affecting productivity, performance, and just the general culture. And we can try to find the reasons for it and blame and point fingers, but it doesn't really matter. The reality is, until everyone starts focusing on who they're being, and the leadership in these companies start creating the conditions where they focus on who they're being, and they provide that opportunity to their employees to develop emotional sobriety and to develop a sense of power, so that people are not walking reactions and victims to all of life. Until that happens, this won't get resolved.
So the last question here, what is the goal then? You know, what I'm hearing you say, if I was new to this information and I'm hearing this information for the first time, what I'm hearing you say is don't be triggered by or reactive to the negative emotions, although there is something there for us to learn. And don't necessarily be attached to the positive feelings. Is the intention to be neutral? Is the intention to be happy in the moment? What's the intention when it comes to this scale of being connected to or attached to either side, not being attached to either side, negative, positive?
I think it's captured in the saying, "This too shall pass."
Mm-hmm.
Right? Which is to say that feel the emotions, be totally 100% immersed and present with feeling amazing. You know, you're on a vacation and you're just, you know, you have that moment, or maybe you're out with friends, or whatever the circumstances, it doesn't matter. You're having that moment, what the Japanese call wabi-sabi, where all of life, even though it seems completely out of our control, seems perfect in those moments. And so totally embrace those moments. Just don't get attached to them and try to recreate them. And if it's the negative emotion that's coming up, be completely present in the moment. Feel what's going on. Use it as an opportunity to look under the surface and see what might be out of alignment, that our emotions, like what might be out of alignment in our life, which our emotions are trying to alert us to, which is really all a negative emotion is. Our emotions are just an alert system. Hey, what you're doing is aligned with who you are. What you're doing is not aligned with who you are. That's it. And so it's a presence thing. It's a presence thing. And then you just move from the next thing to the next experience, to the next experience. You're not attached to avoiding one or recreating one that was amazing. You see, they're just the same side of the same, or different sides of the same coin. We're either trying to avoid, we get attached to avoiding situations that make us have negative emotions, or we get attached to trying to recreate circumstances and situations that had us feel positive emotions. The real goal is, I guess you could call it a sense of neutrality, but I prefer to just call it a present. You're in the present moment. You're just always in the present moment, and you're not trying to avoid or create the conditions to recreate an emotional state.
And all of this is assumed that the person that's having this experience is not also having a mental health issue that needs to be addressed. This is
Sure.
the conversation for people who have worked through some of the stuff that we all go through, right? And the awareness that there is no mental health issue to be aware of, such as schizophrenia or severe PTSD, for example.
Yeah.
We were just having that conversation yesterday. But being aware, but to me, that again ties back into self-awareness, just having that self-awareness. And I know it can be very, very challenging if there's a mental illness at hand. You know, if you have severe PTSD, it's not always easy to notice and recognize, oh, I need some help with my mental state of health.
Yeah.
Oftentimes they think I'm okay, everything's okay. But having that self-awareness and knowing, I mean, the mental health issue, we've talked about that before, which I think could be a whole nother conversation,
Mm-hmm.
as it should be. But the mental health, I mean, the things that we're going through in our society, and especially on the political level, is creating a lot of mental health issues, especially with COVID that we just went through,
Yeah.
2 years ago. I don't know if it's still even going on.
It
Don't.
is. Apparently there's another wave coming or
Oh,
already here. Yeah.
oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, all right. Well, this has been a fantastic conversation. I think I could talk about this for days on end. I just love having these conversations that highlights the human aspect of who we are, what
Yeah.
makes us human, the thing that AI doesn't have. Going back to
Yeah. Well, we didn't even get into that, did we? Yeah. The AI thing is a whole other, it's interesting. There are two things in the world right now going on that seem to be dominating a lot of the news cycle outside of the normal political stuff that, is kind of always with us. And that is the possibility that alien life is actually interacting with human beings. Not the possibility that it exists. I think everyone can conclude that in a universe of 2 trillion galaxies, the probability that there's other life out there is pretty high. So there's no
Yes.
mystery there. But all the congressional hearings and things like that have been going on. There's that, and then there's AI. And we should probably have a separate conversation to touch on both of those, because both of those things are challenging our understanding of our relationship to ourselves as human beings and to each other. It is, it is making us wrestle with what does it really mean to be human. And I couldn't think of a better time to be doing the work that we do at TMIC with whole life architecture and all the things that we do around what is the essence of being a human being, and how do you fully integrate and align yourself to who you authentically are versus the conditioning that you've been trained to believe is who you are, from friends, family, community as you were growing up. And just we pick it up. We just are automatically conditioned by those around us and by circumstance. When you flip it and you're no longer outwardly focused and in reaction to all of those people and those circumstances, and instead you are looking at who am I authentically, and you get really curious about the question that Lewis Carroll wrote in Alice in Wonderland, right? When the caterpillar says to Alice, "Who are you?" And Socrates even said that to know thyself, and that the unexamined life is not worth living. So that's what there is to do, is to actually shift from being a human doing back into a human being. And in order to do that, you got to know who the human being is. And AI and aliens are really making us question a lot of the old tropes and perspectives that we had on what it was to be a human being and our role in the universe. And are we really the most intelligent thing, or are we now creating a super intelligence that's more intelligent than us? And what does that mean for us? And what is the essence of being human when AI can pretty much do everything that we do? Well, what do we need us for, right? Conversation for another time, but definitely a big one to delve into for sure.
Absolutely. And I'm looking forward to that conversation.
All right, September. Well, it's been fascinating. And as usual, having this chat, this conversation, we hope all of you who are listening and watching enjoyed it. And we encourage you to tune in for another conversation on the most important conversations. We'll see you next time.
That concludes this episode of The Most Important Conversations. This in-depth conversation could set you on the path to self-improvement, which is essential if you want to be an effective leader and take meaningful action in your life. If you enjoyed this episode and want more of these stimulating discussions, you can find them at tmicglobal.com. Remember, the world is at a crossroads right now. You can't afford to waste this opportunity to take charge of your life, build meaningful relationships with others, and co-create a brighter tomorrow. Thank you for listening. See you on the next one.